I have lived long enough to know that fate whispers before it roars. At the will reading, my son leaned in close, whispering poison in my ear, promising I would leave empty-handed. He thought he had stolen my place, my dignity, my future. But fate was listening too. And when the lawyer spoke his next words, it was as though the universe itself rose up to defend me. My son's smirk cracked, his laughter died, and the very ground beneath his pride gave way. This is my story. Stay with me until the end, and if you've ever faced betrayal, share your voice in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe because your story deserves to be heard. The lawyer's office smelled of leather, old paper, and the faint polish of wood that had seen decades of secrets. I sat at the long oak table, back straight, hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. My son David sat on my right, closer than I wanted him to be. His presence pressed in on me, his cologne sharp in the air, the kind of expensive scent meant to make a statement. He wore it like armor, as if perfume and cufflinks could crown him king before a single word was read. He leaned in just enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath near my cheek. His voice slid into my ear, low and cruel. "You won't get a dime, Mom. You gave that up years ago." I blinked hard, but I didn't answer. His words stung, but silence was the only shield I had left. He leaned back with a grin, a quiet chuckle rolling in his throat. He thought this day belonged to him alone. I stared at the polished surface of the table, and for a brief moment, I saw a reflection of myself staring back, older now, lined with years of sacrifice. I had worked double shifts when he was young, poured myself into raising him after his father walked out. I had patched scraped knees, packed school lunches, sat through late-night homework battles. And now here I was, being mocked in a lawyer's office as though none of it had ever mattered. The lawyer, Mr. Jennings, sat at the head of the table. He was a careful man, gray-haired, with round glasses that magnified his steady eyes. In front of him was a stack of folders so neat they looked like they'd been measured with a ruler. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat softly, and gave me one quick glance before shifting back to David. David didn't notice. He was too busy tapping his silver cufflinks against the wood, too busy basking in the glow of a victory he believed had already been won. His leg bounced under the table like a child waiting for candy, though nothing about his face resembled the boy I once knew. My chest ached as memories surged. Birthdays with balloons taped to the kitchen wall. Christmas mornings where his laughter filled the house louder than the carols on the radio. I used to think those moments meant something permanent, like they would anchor him to me forever. But money has a way of loosening every tie. I forced myself to breathe slowly. My heart hammered, but I sat tall. I would not let him see me break. Not now. Not in this room. "Let's begin," Mr. Jennings said at last, his voice calm but carrying authority. The sound hushed the air around us. He opened the first folder and began with the formalities. Names, dates, the size of the estate. His tone was measured, professional, but each word seemed to echo too loudly against the paneled walls. David leaned back in his chair, shoulders relaxed, mouth curved in a smirk that grew with each sentence. He nodded to himself, already rehearsing the way he'd spend what he thought was his. His arrogance filled the room like smoke. And then something shifted. It's difficult to explain, but the very air seemed to grow heavier. The light through the blinds dimmed, shadows stretching long across the carpet. For a moment, it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. My spine prickled and I felt a chill crawl across my skin. I had lived long enough to recognize that sensation, the quiet before fate reveals itself. I closed my eyes just long enough to whisper a prayer in my heart. "Lord, don't let him laugh at me like this. Not after everything." When I opened them, Mr. Jennings was looking directly at me. His gaze lingered, steady, as though he knew something I didn't. Something David hadn't even considered. He pressed his lips together, almost like he was holding back a secret that was about to burst free. David still didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in himself, his smirk now wide enough to show the tips of his teeth. He thought this was his coronation, his moment to rise above me once and for all. Mr. Jennings shifted in his chair. The sound of his papers rustling was small, but it cut through the silence like thunder. He looked at David, then back at me, and finally spoke. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, "I'd advise you to stay seated. What comes next concerns you." David's head snapped toward the lawyer. The smirk wavered just for a second before he forced it back onto his face. His eyes darted between me and the man at the head of the table, confusion flickering where arrogance had lived only moments before. The room was silent, except for the sound of David's uneven breathing. His confidence, the arrogance he wore like a crown, had begun to crack. And I knew in that instant that this story wasn't finished. Fate had only just begun to speak. When Mr. Jennings told me to stay seated, I felt the weight of all the years that had brought me to this very moment. And as the lawyer shuffled his papers, my mind drifted backward, into the long road of sacrifice that my son would never acknowledge. My name is Margaret Lawson. I am 69 years old, and for most of my life I was the one holding everything together when no one else would. Charleston, South Carolina, was not always an easy place for a single mother, especially in the late 70s. But when my husband Thomas walked out, I picked up the pieces alone. I had no choice. I worked double shifts at the hospital, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch. My feet would ache so badly I thought I might never walk again, but I still came home and made dinner. I folded laundry at the kitchen table while David finished his homework. When he cried at night, missing his father, I sat on the edge of his bed and promised him he would never be without love. Those promises carried me through years of exhaustion. Every dollar I earned went toward his shoes, his school supplies, his baseball uniforms. I didn't buy new clothes for myself. I didn't take vacations. I didn't even replace the broken washing machine until the neighbors took pity and helped me carry one in from their garage. I told myself it was worth it. He was my son. He was my future. But as David grew older, I began to notice the changes. He liked expensive things, things we couldn't afford. He complained about the second-hand sneakers I bought when the name brands were out of reach. He rolled his eyes when I asked him to mow the lawn or help me with groceries. At first, I thought it was normal teenage rebellion. Boys push back. They test boundaries. I thought if I just kept loving him, he'd grow out of it. But when he went off to college, everything shifted. He stopped calling as often. He told his friends his father was the reason he could afford tuition, though it was my savings and my loans that paid most of it. When he came home for the holidays, he acted like he was visiting a stranger. My small house embarrassed him. My job as a nurse didn't impress him. I was no longer the mother who held him up. I was the woman standing in the way of his climb. I remember the first time I saw him in one of those tailored suits. He had picked me up for dinner, a rare gesture, and I thought maybe he was trying to make amends. But halfway through the meal, he told me bluntly that he wanted me to sign over any rights I might have to his father's assets. He said it was cleaner that way. Easier for everyone. I had stared at him, my fork frozen in the air. I told him I didn't have anything of his father's, that my life was my own. But the look in his eyes that night, cold, calculating, stayed with me. It was the moment I realized the boy I raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw family only as numbers on a ledger. Now, sitting in that lawyer's office, I understood why his smirk cut so deep. It wasn't just about the money. It was about everything I had given that he had thrown away. Mr. Jennings cleared his throat again, drawing me back to the present. David shifted in his chair, restless, certain of his victory. His cufflinks glinted as he tapped them against the wood, a steady rhythm marking the seconds until his imagined triumph. I studied him closely. His hair carefully styled, his tie knotted tight, his shoes polished to a shine. He looked like a man who had conquered the world. But beneath the surface I saw something else. The same restless boy who once couldn't stand not getting his way. He hadn't grown out of that. He had just learned how to dress it up in a suit. Me. I was no longer the young mother running on coffee and overtime hours. I was older now, yes, but I was also steadier, wiser. I had learned how to bend without breaking. Struck me then how life builds you slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize you are stronger than you ever knew. And the woman who once thought she had nothing left was about to find out she had more power than she ever imagined. David couldn't see it yet, but soon he would. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with anticipation. Mr. Jennings adjusted his glasses, his fingers brushing over the folder in front of him. I sat motionless, though every muscle in my body was tight. Beside me, David leaned back in his chair like a man who already owned the world. He tilted his head toward me again, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "I told you, Mom. Nothing here belongs to you. Dad made sure of that." Then he laughed. Not loud but sharp. A private laugh meant only for me, a laugh that stripped me bare in front of strangers. I pressed my hands together in my lap until my knuckles ached. My heart thudded in my chest, and for a brief second I wondered if everyone else in the room could hear it. He wanted to humiliate me, and he was doing a fine job. I thought about all the nights I had worked when he was young. The double shifts at the hospital, the mornings I came home so tired I could barely stand. I thought about the Christmas when I couldn't afford presents, so I wrapped up his old toys just so he'd have something to open. I thought about the years I went without so that he could have a chance. And now here I was, sitting beside a man who had once been my child, being told I was worth nothing. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his cufflinks catching the light. He looked at Mr. Jennings with a smug smile as if to hurry him along. He wanted to hear the words that would erase me. The lawyer began to read. His voice was steady, professional, but each word carried weight. He spoke of properties, bank accounts, investments, and each time David's name was mentioned, my son sat taller, his grin growing wider. When the lawyer paused, David turned to me again. His eyes gleamed. "You see, Mom? You're a guest here, nothing more. This is mine now." The words pierced deeper than any knife. Guest. That's what I had become in his story. Not a mother, not a woman who gave him life, but an outsider in the family I built with my own hands. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Mr. Jennings cleared his throat. He shuffled the papers slowly, carefully, and glanced at me once more. His expression was unreadable, but in that moment I sensed something. A shift. As though the story David thought was written in stone was not finished at all. David didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in himself. He tapped his fingers against the table, humming under his breath, the picture of triumph. I studied him, really studied him. The boy I once held in my arms was gone, replaced by a man intoxicated with greed. His laughter echoed inside me, but instead of breaking me, it began to harden something deep within my chest. I realized then that his cruelty no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how calm I felt, even as he tried to tear me down. I straightened in my chair, my eyes fixed on Mr. Jennings. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I could feel it building, waiting to break free. David leaned back once more, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't take it so hard, Mom. You'll be fine. Maybe you can sell the old house." "Oh wait, you already did, didn't you? Guess that means you really have nothing left." The words landed like blows, each one meant to humiliate. But instead of sinking me, they gave me clarity. He thought I was weak. He thought this was the end of my story. But he had no idea what was waiting in the pages still to be read. Mr. Jennings adjusted his glasses again and cleared his throat. His hand hovered over the next folder, thicker than the rest. The room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier, as though something important was about to unfold. I looked at David out of the corner of my eye. His smirk was fixed, his posture relaxed, every inch of him convinced that he was untouchable. But I knew better. Life has a way of humbling those who laugh too soon. And as I sat in that office, my son's words still burning in my ears, I felt the shift deep inside me. I was not defeated. Not yet. Because sometimes the cruelest words are only the beginning of the reckoning. The lawyer's office faded behind me, but my son's words clung like a stain I couldn't wash away. "You're nothing. You gave it all up. Those words echoed in my head as I walked slowly to my car, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. I sat behind the wheel for nearly an hour, staring at nothing. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, and my chest felt hollow, as though everything I had carried for years had suddenly collapsed. For the first time in my life, I felt invisible. Not a mother, not a woman, just a discarded piece of someone else's story. The drive home was a blur. Charleston streets were alive with their usual rhythm. Children running in yards, the hum of traffic, the smell of the ocean drifting in on the wind. Yet I felt cut off from it all, as though I were trapped in a glass box, watching life move on without me. When I stepped inside my house, the silence pressed down heavier than usual. The living room still carried faint traces of David's childhood. A dent in the wall where his toy car once crashed. A faded photograph of him grinning with missing front teeth. I touched the frame and my throat tightened. That little boy would never have spoken to me the way the man in that office did. I sank into my old armchair, the fabric worn thin from years of use. For a long while I didn't move. My body felt drained, my spirit bruised. I wondered if maybe David was right, if I had truly been written out of everything. Maybe I had no place left in this family's story. But then, as I stared across the room, my eyes fell on an old cedar chest tucked in the corner. It had been there for decades, gathering dust. I hadn't opened it in years, not since after the divorce. Something stirred inside me, a quiet nudge, a whisper almost, and I rose slowly to my feet. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of old papers, photographs, and yellowed envelopes, most of them untouched for years. My hands moved through them, shaking as I pulled one envelope free from the bottom of the pile. It was thick, the paper slightly brittle with age. My ex-husband's handwriting sprawled across the front in sharp, familiar strokes. My breath caught. I remembered him drafting agreements and contracts back then, most of which I wanted nothing to do with after the divorce. But something told me to open this one. I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the papers inside. My eyes scanned the lines, and as I read, my heart began to race. It was a contract dated years ago, granting me direct ownership of shares in one of his companies. Not a temporary gift. Not something tied to marriage. Legal ownership, permanent, binding, and untouched by the divorce. I pressed a hand to my mouth. The company name was familiar, one I had heard whispered about in the news. Small when it began, but over the years it had grown, expanded, and thrived. The shares listed here weren't just valuable, they were worth a fortune. I sank back into my chair, the papers clutched tight in my hands. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. Could this be real? Could I have spent all these years believing I had nothing, while a hidden thread of security had been waiting in the dark? The more I read, the clearer it became. My ex-husband had set this aside deliberately, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of some sense of obligation. Whatever his reason, the document was real, stamped and signed. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't just tears of sadness anymore. They carried something else, a fragile spark of hope. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me shift, not from despair but from possibility. I thought of David, so smug in that lawyer's office, certain I had nothing. He had no idea what lay tucked away in an old cedar chest. No idea that the mother he mocked might still hold cards he couldn't see. I closed the lid gently and pressed my palm against the wood. My body still ached from the humiliation of that day, but inside me something had changed. I was not finished. I had been bent, yes. Wounded, yes. But not broken. Because sometimes rock bottom is not the end. Sometimes it's the floor you push off from when you rise again. I held that contract in my trembling hands for what felt like hours. The more I read, the clearer it became. My ex-husband had left me something no one could take away. Those company shares weren't just scraps forgotten in a drawer. They were power. And I knew deep down that David had no idea they existed. That realization lit something inside me. A quiet spark at first, small but steady. For years, I had let myself believe I was invisible in this family's story. But these papers told me otherwise. I wasn't erased. I wasn't done. I placed the envelope carefully back inside the cedar chest, then took it to my desk. My hands still shook as I picked up the phone. I called Mr. Jennings's office and asked for a private meeting. He agreed, his tone respectful, almost cautious, as though he had suspected there was more to my story than David wanted to believe. When I sat across from him later that week, the papers neatly stacked on his desk, he looked them over with sharp eyes. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a low breath. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "these shares are valid. They've grown significantly in value over the years. You are, in fact, one of the majority shareholders in this company." The words settled over me slowly. Majority shareholder. It sounded surreal, almost like he was speaking to someone else. But he wasn't. He was speaking to me. I nodded, still absorbing it. "And David, he doesn't know?" Mr. Jennings shook his head. "No. These documents were separate from the estate. They were drawn up privately years ago. Unless you choose to tell him, he won't find out." For the first time in a long while, I felt something stronger than despair. I felt choice. I had the power to decide when and how this secret would come to light. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. David's laughter echoed in my mind, sharp and cruel, but now it no longer left me powerless. I imagined the look on his face when he realized the truth. That smirk of his wiped clean in an instant. The thought gave me a strange comfort, like a candle burning in the dark. So I knew I couldn't rush. If I revealed this too soon, David would twist it, argue it, maybe even try to fight it in court. But I had to be careful. I had to move quietly, like a gardener tending a seed before it's ready to bloom. The days passed and I began gathering more information. I met with financial advisors recommended by Mr. Jennings, men and women who treated me with a respect I hadn't felt in years. They explained the worth of my shares, the dividends I could claim, and the influence I now held within the company. Each meeting left me stronger, more certain that I wasn't at the mercy of my son anymore. All the while, David remained smug, parading his supposed inheritance like a crown in front of anyone who would listen. He didn't know the foundation of his arrogance was already crumbling beneath him. And I said nothing. At church, I kept my head high, though whispers about the Lawson estate circled among neighbors. Some pitied me, assuming I'd been cast aside. Others avoided the subject altogether. I let them think what they wanted. Truth has a way of surfacing when the time is right. In the quiet of my home, I began to feel different. Not just stronger, but steadier. For years, I had bent under the weight of disappointment, bowed under my son's indifference. But now, for the first time, I stood taller in my own skin. I was no longer clinging to scraps of the past. I was preparing for a future David could never have imagined. One evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing yet another letter from the company, I caught sight of a reflection in the window. My face, lined with years of struggle, but my eyes brighter than they had been in a long time. I whispered to myself, "Margaret, you are not finished yet." That whisper wasn't desperation anymore. It was resolve. I folded the documents neatly and locked them in a drawer. David still believed I was powerless. He still thought I was the guest at the table, the discarded mother who had nothing. But soon enough he would see the truth. Because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is the one no one sees coming. Weeks passed and I kept my secret close. The documents stayed locked in my desk drawer, but their presence gave me a strength I hadn't felt in years. Every morning when I poured my coffee, I thought of them waiting there. A reminder that I was not powerless, no matter how much David wanted me to believe otherwise. David, of course, strutted through town as though the world already belonged to him. Word spread quickly in Charleston. People whispered about the Lawson inheritance, about how David would be living large now. He leaned into the attention, showing up at restaurants he used to sneer at, ordering the most expensive wine on the menu, telling anyone who would listen about the fortune his father left him. But whispers travel faster than pride. I began to hear a different kind of talk. Quiet murmurs about David's debts, about money he had borrowed long before the will was read. Rumors of business deals gone wrong, of loans he had promised to repay with the inheritance he thought was guaranteed. One afternoon, while walking back from the market, I overheard two men at the corner store speaking his name. "Fella's overextended," one said. "Counting money he don't even have yet." The other chuckled. "That boy's headed for a fall." I walked past them with my head high, but inside my heart twisted. My son was digging himself into a hole and he didn't even see it. That week I invited David over for dinner. He arrived late, dressed in a crisp suit, his tie loosened as if the day had already worn him out. He barely kissed my cheek before pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Mom," he said casually, "I need you to co-sign on something for me. Just temporary. A small loan until the estate clears. You understand." I stared at him across the table, my fork still in my hand. His eyes didn't meet mine. He was already scanning his phone, impatient. It hit me then, he wasn't asking. He was assuming. "No, David," I said quietly. "I won't." His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean you won't? It's just paperwork. You don't even have to do anything after that." I said no. My voice was firm, steadier than I expected. The silence that followed was sharp. He slammed his glass on the table, amber liquid sloshing over the rim. "You're unbelievable. After everything Dad left me, after everything I've built, you can't do one simple thing." I held his gaze. "You've built nothing, David. You're gambling on money you don't even have yet." His face flushed red and for a moment I thought he might explode. But then he forced a laugh, shaking his head as if I were the one who didn't understand. He stood up, straightening his jacket. "You'll regret this, Mom. You always do." He left without finishing his meal, the front door slamming so hard the frame rattled. I sat alone at the table, staring at the spilled whiskey. My chest hurt, but not from fear anymore. From clarity. My son was not just arrogant, he was reckless. And the higher he climbed on his illusions, the harder he would fall. Meanwhile, I kept moving in silence. Meetings with financial advisors continued. Each one confirmed the same thing. The shares in my name were powerful, growing more valuable by the day. I had options. Influence. Leverage. And I didn't breathe a word of it to David. Instead, I watched as his facade began to crack. Creditors started calling. Old friends stopped answering his texts. One evening, I passed a cafe and saw him sitting with a woman I didn't know, his face drawn tight, his hands gesturing wildly as if he were begging her for something. She shook her head and left him sitting there alone. For the first time, I didn't feel pity. I felt distance. My son had chosen greed over love, arrogance over humility. And now life was teaching him what I no longer needed to say out loud. At night, when I lay down to rest, I thought of the papers locked away in my drawer. They were no longer just documents. They were my shield. My reminder that I was not as fragile as David believed. He thought he had erased me. But what he didn't know was that I had been quietly writing myself back into the story. And soon, very soon, the truth would no longer stay hidden. The day of the second estate meeting arrived, and with it came the storm I had been waiting for. Mr. Jennings had called me personally a week before, explaining that certain details still needed to be finalized. He suggested that both David and I attend. His tone carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I dressed carefully that morning, not in anything fancy, but in the clothes that made me feel steady. A navy skirt, a cream blouse, and the small pearl earrings I had owned for decades. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw the lines of age, yes, but also a calm strength I hadn't seen in years. David arrived at the law office ahead of me. When I walked in, he was already lounging in a chair, his phone in his hand, his leg bouncing with that same restless arrogance. He barely looked up when I entered, only muttering, "You're late," before smirking down at his screen. I said nothing. I simply sat across from him, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Mr. Jennings entered the room with his usual quiet authority. He greeted us both, then took his seat at the head of the table. For a moment, The only sound was the rustle of papers as he organized the files in front of him. Then he cleared his throat. "Mr. Lawson," he said, addressing David first, "as we've discussed, the estate leaves you with several properties, accounts, and investments. These assets are significant, but they are not the entirety of your father's holdings." David leaned forward eagerly, his eyes gleaming. "Go on," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. Mr. Jennings adjusted his glasses and pulled out a thicker folder. "What has not yet been disclosed," he continued, "is that certain assets were legally transferred years ago. Assets that do not fall under the terms of this estate, but remain binding to this day." David's smirk faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Jennings looked at me. "Mrs. Lawson, these assets belong to you." The room went silent. I sat perfectly still, though my heart pounded in my chest. David turned sharply toward me, his face pale. "What? That's impossible. She signed everything away. She doesn't have anything." Mr. Jennings shook his head firmly. "On the contrary, these documents are valid, signed and recorded years before the divorce was finalized. Mrs. Lawson retains majority shares in Lawson Maritime, the shipping company that has grown into one of the most profitable ventures in the region. Current estimates place the value of her holdings at," he glanced down at the papers, "over $12 million. David's jaw dropped. His hands, which had been drumming confidently on the table minutes before, now gripped the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. That can't be," he stammered. "That company belongs to me. To me." Mr. Jennings's voice was calm, unshaken. "No, Mr. Lawson. The company belongs in majority to your mother. That is the legal reality." The silence that followed was thick. I finally turned my eyes to David, and for the first time in years, I saw something different in his face. Fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply spoke the truth. "You laughed at me, David. You told me I was nothing. But you see, I was never erased. I was here all along." His face twisted red with fury. "You tricked me. You knew about this." I shook my head slowly. "I didn't trick you. I survived you. And there's a difference." Mr. Jennings shuffled the papers into a neat stack and closed the folder. "The matter is settled," he said firmly. David leaned back in his chair, his chest heaving. For the first time his smirk was gone. He looked small, smaller than I had ever seen him. Me. I felt steady. Not triumphant, not boastful, just steady. The balance had shifted, and justice had found its way back into the room. Because sometimes when pride shouts the loudest, truth waits in silence, until it roars. The silence in that office lingered long after Mr. Jennings finished speaking. David sat frozen, his mouth half open, his face pale, as though the floor had been ripped out from under him. For years he had walked around convinced he was untouchable. And now, in a single moment, the crown he thought he wore was gone. He slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't fair. You can't do this to me." His voice cracked with rage. Mr. Jennings didn't flinch. He only adjusted his glasses and replied calmly, "This was your father's decision. These documents are legal and binding. There is nothing unfair about honoring them." David turned on me, his eyes blazing. You've been sitting there letting me make a fool of myself. How could you do this?" I met his gaze, steady as stone. "How could you laugh in your mother's face? How could you treat me like I was nothing?" My voice was quiet, but the weight of it filled the room. For the first time, David had no ready comeback. He just stared at me, his chest heaving, his lips trembling. The smirk that had once been his shield was gone, replaced with something rawer, desperation. He pushed his chair back and stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You don't understand, Mom. I've already made commitments. People are expecting me to pay them back. I can't lose this money." But there was the truth he thought he could hide. his debts, his reckless spending, the holes he had dug too deep to climb out of. Mr. Jennings spoke again, his voice even. "Mr. Lawson, your financial obligations are not this office's concern. What we deal with here is fact. And the fact is your mother holds the greater share." David stopped pacing, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get it. If word gets out that I don't have this money, I'm finished. Everything I've built will fall apart." I looked at him, and for a brief moment I saw not the grown man, but the boy he used to be, red-faced after losing a baseball game, crying in frustration when life didn't bend his way. He had never learned how to lose with grace. And now he was about to learn the hardest lesson of all. "David," I said softly, "what you built was never yours. It was always borrowed. Borrowed pride, borrowed money, borrowed respect. And now it's time to face that." He froze, staring at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he was seeing for the first time a mother who wasn't bent under his arrogance, but standing tall in her own right. The room grew heavy with his silence. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and stormed out, the door slamming so hard the walls seemed to shake. I sat there a moment longer, my hands still folded neatly in my lap. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. From release. From the weight finally lifting after so many years of being told I was less than I truly was. Mr. Jennings gave me a small nod. "Mrs. Lawson, you handled that with dignity." I managed a faint smile. I didn't come here to humiliate him. I just came to take back what was mine. As I left the office, the sunlight outside felt different. Warmer, brighter, as though the world itself had shifted. People hurried past on the busy street, unaware that my life had just turned a corner. But I felt it in every step I took. For so long, David's laughter had echoed in my mind like chains. But now those chains had snapped. He could rage, he could blame, he could drown in his debts, but he could no longer erase me. Because the truth had spoken, and once spoken, truth cannot be silenced. After David stormed out of the lawyer's office, the silence he left behind felt almost holy. For years his voice had drowned out mine, sharp, dismissive, cruel. But now, for the first time, I walked out with my head high, not carrying his words like a burden but leaving them behind like ashes on the ground. The days that followed brought a strange calm. I no longer woke with the ache of defeat. Instead, I woke with purpose. Each morning, I brewed my coffee, sat at the small kitchen table, and went through the letters from the company. Legal documents, financial statements, invitations to board meetings. Proof that I was not invisible, not erased. I kept thinking about David. Part of me wanted to believe he would come knocking, ready to apologize. But deep down I knew better. His pride was a mountain too high to climb down easily. And so, I did what I had always done. I moved forward. I began making decisions about the shares, not grand gestures but steady ones. I arranged for dividends to be sent directly into a separate account. I consulted with Mr. Jennings and a financial advisor about how best to use the money. Not for luxury, not for vanity, but for something meaningful. One evening, as I sat with my checkbook, I thought about the women I had met at the hospital years ago. Single mothers, stretched thin, balancing work and children with nothing left for themselves. I remembered the exhaustion in their faces, exhaustion I knew too well. And I made a decision. I would use part of my money to fund scholarships for young nurses, especially those raising children on their own. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about turning pain into something that could heal. Meanwhile, David's name was making its way through Charleston again, but this time not with admiration. I overheard conversations at the grocery store, whispers at church. Words like debt, failed investments, burned bridges. People who once laughed at his jokes now shook their heads when his name was mentioned. I didn't take joy in it. A mother never does, no matter how deep the hurt. But I couldn't protect him anymore, not from the choices he had made. Weeks later, he appeared at my door. It was late evening, and the porch light cast long shadows across his face. He looked older, worn down, his confidence stripped away. "Mom," he said, his voice low. Can we talk? I let him in. He sat on the couch, his hands clasped together, restless like a boy again. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the words we hadn't said. Finally he broke it. I'm sorry. For the things I said. For everything. His voice cracked, and for the first time in years I believed it. I studied him, my heart torn between anger and tenderness. This was the same man who had laughed in my face, who had tried to erase me. And yet he was also my son. Blood of my blood. I don't know if sorry is enough, David, I said softly. You didn't just hurt me. You discarded me. You treated me as if I was nothing. That wound doesn't heal overnight. His eyes filled with tears, though he blinked them back quickly. I was stupid. I thought money meant power. I thought it made me better. But I was wrong. For a moment I almost reached for his hand. Almost. But then I stopped myself. Forgiveness is not a gift you hand out like spare change. It has to be earned brick by brick. I'll always be your mother, I told him. And I don't wish you harm. But I can't rescue you from the consequences of your choices. That's for you to face. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. I understand. We sat in silence a little longer, the distance between us as real as the coffee table that separated our chairs. I didn't know if we could rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time, there was at least the faintest outline of a beginning. After he left that night, I stood at the window watching him walk down the street. My heart ached, but it also felt strangely light. Because I had spoken the truth, and I had done it without anger. Life had taught me that resolution doesn't always come with hugs and tears. Sometimes it comes quietly, with the strength to stand firm, with the dignity to say, enough. And that was where I stood now, at the fragile start of something new. And so, after David left that night, I stood in the quiet of my living room, the echo of our conversation still hanging in the air. I didn't know if true healing would ever come between us, but I knew one thing with certainty. I had finally reclaimed myself. The days that followed were not filled with triumph or grand celebrations. They were filled with something far more precious: peace. For the first time in years, I woke each morning without the weight of shame pressing on my chest. I poured my coffee, opened my curtains, and let the sunlight stream in without fear of what the day might bring. The papers in my drawer, those company shares that had once been a hidden secret, were no longer just numbers on a page. They were a reminder that I was never powerless, not even in the years when I felt forgotten. They were proof that dignity can be buried but never destroyed. I didn't rush to spend the money. I didn't chase after luxury. Instead, I chose carefully. I funded scholarships for young nurses who reminded me of myself. Tired but determined, giving everything for their families. I gave to programs that supported single mothers, women who knew the sting of being abandoned but still found the courage to stand tall. Each time I signed a check, I felt a piece of my own story come full circle. The sacrifices I made, the nights I worked until my bones ached, the moments I went without, none of it had been wasted. My life had built something after all, something stronger than money. As for David, I saw him only sparingly in those months. He kept his distance, pride still standing like a wall between us. But the next time he came to my door, he didn't smirk. He didn't boast. He stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, his eyes lowered. He was still my son, but he was no longer the man who had laughed in my face at the lawyer's table. He was humbled. Broken perhaps, but not beyond repair. I didn't open my arms to him immediately. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It is a path you walk one step at a time. But I left the door cracked open, enough for him to know that if he chose to change, I would not turn him away. And in the meantime, I built my own peace. I learned to enjoy the quiet of my evenings, to sit on the porch and listen to the cicadas, to breathe in the salt air that drifts in from the Charleston coast. I found joy in small things again, the kind of joy no inheritance could ever buy. Looking back now, I realize that life doesn't always give us the justice we ask for. Sometimes it gives us something better, the justice we didn't know we needed. My son's arrogance had tried to erase me, but in the end, it only revealed how strong I truly was. And so, I close this chapter with dignity. Not with bitterness, not with anger, but with the kind of wisdom only years and heartbreak can bring. To anyone listening who has faced betrayal, I say this: you are not powerless. Even when the people closest to you try to silence your worth, remember, truth has a way of finding its voice. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe for more, and if you've faced your own betrayal, share it in the comments. Your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard.